In the spring of 1945, American troops pushing into Germany began finding rifles that looked broken, not dented, not blown apart, bent. The barrel curved away in a smooth arc, down and off to one side, with a small mirrored frame bolted above it. Most of the men who picked one up reached the same conclusion: shell damage, or somebody's joke. It was neither. That curve was formed in a factory, deliberately to a specified angle. And by the time those rifles were being pulled out of the mud, the German war economy had tens of thousands of them on order. It also wasn't a bunker fantasy from the final weeks. The engineering behind that curve began 3 years earlier, and it didn't begin with a soldier. Before the device, though, the problem. Because the problem was real. It was 30 years old, and in 1944, nobody had solved it. Start with a tank. A tank's gun can only depress so far. Below that limit, there's a ring of ground the crew physically cannot shoot into, a band of dead space that begins at the tread and runs out a few meters. The whole machine gun doesn't help. It's fixed forward, staring at the horizon. So a man lying against the side of a Panther is, in a precise mechanical sense, invisible, not hidden, untouchable, and he only needs seconds. Long enough to wedge a charge into the running gear. Long enough to get a bottle of petrol onto the engine deck. What could the crew actually do about it? Almost nothing good. Some vehicles had a pistol port, a hole barely wide enough to push a handgun through, with a field of view to match. Otherwise, you cracked a hatch and put a head and shoulders out into daylight, which is the one thing a tank crew exists to avoid. Or you drove blind and hoped you rolled over him instead of past him. The Germans understood the gap well enough to keep throwing hardware at it. Late war vehicles received the Nahverteidigungswaffe, a launcher set into the turret roof, firing anti-personnel and smoke rounds almost vertically, so they burst above the tank and swept the ground around it. A weapon aimed at nothing in particular because there was no way to aim at something nobody could see. Now climb out of the tank and stand in a street. By 1943, the fighting in the East had collapsed into rooms, cellars, stairwells, factory floors. And in that environment, the arithmetic of a corner is brutally simple. The man behind cover has time. He can hold a doorway for an hour, breathing, resting, waiting. The man who has to lean out gets 1 or 2 seconds of exposure per attempt, and inside that window he has to find a target, aim, and fire, while the other man already has his sights resting on the exact patch of air where a head is about to appear. That isn't a fair fight, it's a tax. Every corner in every building in every city cost you men, and it cost him nothing. And every workaround was bad. You could throw a grenade blind and hope the room was laid out the way you imagined it. You could push a rifle around the corner one-handed and fire without aiming, spraying a wall. You could send a man out to draw the shot so everyone else could see where it came from. Each option traded away either accuracy or a life. Soldiers had been paying that tax for 30 years. At Gallipoli in 1915, Australian troops rigged rifles to fire from below the parapet. Mirrors clamped to the stock, the weapon pushed up over the lip, aimed through a reflection triggered from cover. Crude, slow, and effective enough that it spread along the line. So the idea was never exotic. What nobody had ever built was a version a man could carry into a house and use in a fast fight. Which leaves you sitting in a German armaments office in 1944 holding 2 faces of one problem. A tank that can't shoot at its own feet, and an infantryman who pays with his life for the privilege of looking. Out of that pressure came a requirement list that reads almost like a dare. Let a man shoot from behind full cover with nothing exposed. Use a weapon already coming off the assembly line. No new cartridge, no new vehicle, no new factory. It bolts on, or it doesn't happen. Bend the barrel, and every one of those boxes gets ticked. On paper, it's the most elegant answer in the file. And the strangest part is where the idea actually came from. Because in 1942, on a German test range, engineers ended up holding a curved gun barrel while solving a problem that had nothing to do with corners, nothing to do with tanks, and nothing to do with killing anyone at all. They weren't trying to shoot around something. They were dealing with a piece of dull industrial housekeeping, and what they noticed while doing it is the reason this rifle exists. The problem on that 1942 test range was garbage disposal. When you build heavy anti-aircraft machine guns, you have to proof fire them, every weapon, live rounds, as a condition of acceptance. At industrial scale, that means somewhere indoors for the bullets to go, on a stand, in a space you control. So German engineers experimented with curved barrel sections, tubes that would take a fired round and turn it, redirect it, put it somewhere safe. Not a weapon, a drain pipe. But somebody standing at that stand understood what he was watching. Bullets were going in one direction and coming out another. Nobody had ever built that as a weapon, because everyone knew you couldn't. A rifled barrel is straight. That isn't a design convention, it's the entire premise. You spin a projectile so it flies point first, and a spinning body resists being turned. Bending the barrel means fighting the exact property the barrel exists to create. The first attempts show how blunt the early thinking was. Engineers took a curved section of 20mm barrel and fitted it over an 8mm rifle muzzle, using the oversized tube as a trough, a chute wide enough that the bullet would skid around the curve rather than be gripped through it. Then they tried it on a Kar 98K, and the concept hit a wall. The 98,000 fires the 7.92 by 57mm Mauser, a full-power rifle cartridge, high chamber pressure, a long, heavy bullet leaving the muzzle at roughly 760 meters per second. Ask that round to change direction inside a few centimeters of steel, and something has to give. There is no clever geometry that lets a full-power rifle cartridge survive a hard turn. And here is where the real story separates from the popular one. The curved barrel didn't become possible because someone got smarter. It became possible because Germany had already developed, for completely unrelated reasons, the one cartridge weak enough to survive the trip. The 7.92 by 33mm Kurz, or short Team, was the intermediate round built for the new assault rifle, the MP-43, which became the Sturmgewehr 44. Shorter case, less propellant, a lighter and stubbier bullet, muzzle velocity down around 685 meters per second instead of 760, and considerably lower pressure. It also happened to be the only thing in the German arsenal that could be persuaded around a corner without coming apart on the spot. So this device is not an accessory that was fitted to the Sturmgewehr 44. It is a device that could only exist because the Sturmgewehr 44 existed. Change the cartridge and the whole concept evaporates. That dependency explains something otherwise strange in the record. Why the German Armored Corps, which had been pushing hardest for an answer to the tank dead zone, ended up waiting on an infantry rifle program it had no stake in. The hardware itself was built with more care than its reputation suggests. The barrel was rifled first, straight, on standard machinery. Then it was cold-formed into the curve, bent after the rifling was cut. So the grooves followed the bend instead of being machined into an already curved tube. The finished unit clamped onto the muzzle. Nothing about the rifle was modified. American Ordnance officers, examining one after the war, wrote that the thing violated the old theory that a rifled barrel had to be straight. That sentence wasn't sarcasm. They meant it as an observation about the edge of what was known. Then comes the part almost nobody thinks about, and it decided everything. Bend the barrel and you destroy the sights. The rear sight and the front post are aligned to a straight bore. Curve the muzzle 30 degrees and they point at a wall or a patch of dirt, anywhere except where the bullet is going. You have built a weapon that shoots around a corner and cannot be aimed around a corner, which is worthless. Because the entire purpose was keeping the shooter's head behind cover. The answer was optical, and it was genuinely clever. A frame above the attachment carried a pair of mirrors, and Zeiss developed a prismatic sighting device to work with it. The shooter didn't look at the target. He looked into the mirror system, and what he saw in there was his own front sight, sitting on the target. You aim with the rifle's standard iron sights. You just view them second-hand. The armored version was heavier. A periscopic sight designated the Winkelzielfernrohr WZF5811, paired with the barrel unit in a ball mount, a Kugeleffet, set into the vehicle roof so a crewman could traverse it from inside. Both versions share the same architecture, and one thing about it is worth holding on to. The precision-made, difficult, expensive component here was never the bent tube. It was the glass. If you're here for the mechanism rather than the mythology, the thinking inside the object, failure's included. A subscribe is what keeps this channel making them. It matters for this one in particular, because from here the story stops being clever and starts getting uncomfortable. By late 1944, there wasn't one of these things. There was a family of them, and the spread tells you the sweet spot still hadn't been found. Bends of 30, 45, 60, and 90 degrees. 2 service designations. Vorsatz 1. For infantry, the 30-degree unit, for men fighting around corners and firing out of foxholes. Vorsatz P for Panzer, the 90-degree unit for the roof mount. There was a version worked up for the MG42 as well. And one small detail proves this was real hardware rather than a proposal. The P attachment worked with the MP43 and the Sturmgewehr 44, but not with the MP43/1. The difference between those two variants is the shape of the muzzle end. Somebody had to write that restriction into a document, which means somebody had already tried it and found out. We even know who was behind it, because the Americans asked him. Their report names Colonel Hans Schady of the Research Division of Rheinmetall-Borsig as the inventor, and the technical data in that file came from interrogating him directly in the summer of 1945, alongside an officer from the German Armaments Ministry, which means the engineering claims in it arrived from the man with the strongest possible incentive to make his own device sound better than it was. That matters, because his numbers and the Americans' numbers do not agree. Then they took it to a range and fired it. The targets came back with hits on them, and a lot of those hits were not round holes. Think about what you are actually asking a bullet to do. It leaves the chamber, travels the rifled bore, and reaches the muzzle spinning at a rate measured in the tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. Everything about it is committed to going straight and staying point first. That spin is the only reason it doesn't tumble. Now it enters the curve, and in the space of a few centimeters, less than the length of your hand, it has to change direction by 30 degrees. Nothing about this is gentle. The projectile can't negotiate the bend, it gets forced through it. The copper jacket slams into the outer wall of the curve and is dragged along it under enormous side load, while the soft lead core inside carries on doing what inertia demands, which is going straight. The jacket is being steered, and the core isn't. Friction spikes. Heat spikes. And the gyroscopic stability that the rifling spent the whole length of the barrel building up gets attacked from the side, all at once. The bullet exits. But what exits isn't always a bullet anymore. We know that precisely because the Americans measured it. Captain Philip B. Sharp of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps test-fired the 90-degree version after the war and found that more than 2/3 of the projectiles came out torn into 2 or 3 pieces. Not deformed, broken. His verdict was more interesting than a dismissal. At very short range, he noted, it would still have been lethal. Which is true, and it is the strangest thing about the armored variant. The 90-degree unit had accidentally become a shotgun. a cloud of hot fragments spraying out of a tank roof into the few meters of ground where an enemy soldier had to be standing to plant a charge. Against a man at 4 meters, a disintegrating bullet is a perfectly adequate weapon. Against anything further out, it's noise. Now the infantry version, where the numbers are the ones that actually decided the concept. The 30-degree Vorsatz. I was recorded as producing a group of roughly 35 by 35 centimeters at 100 meters. That figure needs translating. It is not a rifle group. A standard Sturmgewehr 44 fired properly at that distance will put its rounds into a fraction of it. 35 centimeters is about the width of a man's chest. So at 100 meters, your shot lands somewhere inside a square the size of a torso, and which part of the torso is luck. That is pistol-class dispersion, coming out of a weapon whose own rear sight was graduated to 800 meters. Rheinmetall Borsig's claimed figures for the armored version tell the same story from the other end. A maximum of 600 meters for single shots, 300 for bursts. On paper, that reads like a functioning weapon. Set it against a projectile that leaves the muzzle in pieces, and it reads as what it is. A manufacturer's number, produced by a company with an order book to protect. But dispersion isn't even the worst of it. The worst of it is time. Everything about aiming this thing is slow. You are looking into a small mirror at a reflection of your own front sight, trying to place that reflected post onto a target you cannot see directly, while holding a rifle with a heavy steel curve and an optical frame hanging off the muzzle, dragging the balance forward. That works if you are watching one fixed spot and waiting. A doorway, a gap. It falls apart in a close-range firefight where a target appears and vanishes in under a second, and the man who wins is the man already pointing. So the engineers went after the root cause, pressure. And their fix is a specimen of how engineering compromises actually behave. They drilled small vent holes into the curved section, bleeding off propellant gas before it could drive the bullet so hard into the bend. Lower the pressure, soften the turn, reduce the strain on both the projectile and the tube. It worked, in the narrow sense. It also cost velocity and range, making an already limited weapon weaker. It did not meaningfully extend the life of the barrel, and it created 2 new problems out of nothing. Hot gas now venting sideways into the shooter's face, and that same gas clouding the mirror he depended on to aim, which required a third component, a triangular shield, to keep the venting gas off the optics. A fix that reduces performance, doesn't solve the original failure, and generates 2 fresh faults requiring another part. That is not incompetence. That is what it looks like when you are treating symptoms, because the underlying physics won't move. Which brings us to barrel life. The number that was never settled. There are 3 answers on record, and they are wildly apart. Sheda, the inventor, claimed around 6,000 rounds. The figure that has circulated in published literature for decades is about 300 rounds for the 30-degree unit and around 160 for the 45-degree version. That would make the attachment roughly a 7-magazine consumable. And the American report gives something different again. After 2,000 rounds, it recorded the curvature of the barrel had decreased by 1 degree. For comparison, a standard Sturmgewehr 44 barrel was reckoned good for something on the order of 10,000. Those look irreconcilable until you ask a better question. What does worn out mean for a bent barrel? For a straight barrel, death is erosion. The rifling washes out and accuracy decays. This thing has a second failure mode, and it arrives far earlier. The curve is under continuous assault from the outer wall, and it relaxes. It straightens very slightly, shot by shot. And the moment the geometry moves, the mirror is lying to you. The sight was aligned to a specific angle. The barrel is no longer at that angle. The weapon still fires. It simply no longer shoots where it is aimed. And because you cannot see the target directly, you have no way of knowing by how much. So all three figures can be honest at the same time. It survives thousands of rounds as a tube. It stops being an aimable weapon long before that. And the inventor, being questioned by the enemy about his own creation, quoted the most generous reading available. Added up, and the assessment writes itself. Broken projectiles, torso-sized groups, gas in the shooter's face, optics that fog, a barrel whose angle drifts out from under its own sight. American Ordnance, looking at all of it, judged the tank version to be of dubious value, and the infantry version not quite as dubious, which is about as faint as praise gets. The rational response to a file like that is to close the program. In December 1943, Germany ordered 10,000 of them, and that was the small order. 9 months later, the number moved in the wrong direction. From September 1944, Germany added an order for 20,000 of the 90-degree model per month. Then in January 1945, another 30,000 of the 30-degree infantry version, plus an equal quantity of Zeiss sights to go with them. Read those dates against the war? September 1944 is after France is gone and after the summer collapse in the East. January 1945 is a country being bombed around the clock, with weeks of fuel and no strategic reserve left. And in that month, somebody signed for 30,000 bent tubes and 30,000 precision optical sights. Now the reality. The best estimate available from firearms historian Michael Marine puts actual production at roughly 10,000 curved barrels, against orders totaling many times that. Around 5,000 were earmarked for the Wehrmacht, and he suggests roughly 4,000 of those were probably delivered to troops fighting the Soviets. On the armored side, the numbers collapse further. Rheinmetall Borsig was reported to have made and delivered about 500 of the 90-degree Vorsatz P, while Zeiss had produced somewhere around 1,500 sights for the tank device by the end of January 1945. The orders didn't outstrip the physics. They outstripped the factories. But the question worth asking isn't why production failed. It's why the orders were placed at all by people who were holding the test results. And the answer is that inside a collapsing industrial system, this device's real selling point had nothing to do with how well it shot. It bolted on. Consider the alternative. The mechanically correct answer to a tank's dead zone was a remote-controlled machine gun on the roof, a gun a crewman could fire without ever opening a hatch. Germany was already fitting them to late-war vehicles like the Jagdpanzer 38 and the Panzer IV/70. But that meant new mounts, new linkages, new roof castings, new steps on assembly lines already running behind, and it only ever reached vehicles still being built. The thousands of tanks already at the front were unreachable. The curved barrel demanded none of it. No vehicle redesign, no new cartridge, no new rifle. It clamped onto a weapon already in production, and it could, in principle, be shipped in a crate to a unit that already existed. Every expensive change in the system was avoided. That is how it survived a bad test file. Not because anyone believed the physics had been beaten, but because on a procurement sheet it was the cheapest capability increase on offer. And by 1944, cheap was the only currency Germany had left. Except it wasn't cheap. And the proof is sitting inside the order itself. 30,000 barrels. 30,000 sights. Now set that against what Zeiss actually managed for the armored version. About 1,500 in total. That ratio is the whole answer. Bending a steel tube is blacksmith work. Any competent shop with a mandrel and a furnace can turn out curved barrels, and Germany had thousands of such shops. Grinding and assembling a prismatic sight to military tolerance is something else entirely. Optical glass, skilled hands, clean conditions, calibration. And every one of those inputs was already fully committed to gun sights, rangefinders, periscopes, and binoculars for weapons that unambiguously worked. So the bottleneck was never the strange part. The strange part was easy. This thing was strangled by the boring component, a mirror in a frame. A device sold to the system on the promise of being cheap turned out to be competing for the scarcest manufacturing capacity in the country. Then there's the frontline arithmetic, which is worse. By 1945, the Sturmgewehr 44 itself was in short supply. Units were receiving assault rifles piecemeal, and a man who had one was in no hurry to experiment on it. Now hand him an attachment with a service life measured in a few hundred rounds. That makes it a consumable, not equipment, closer to ammunition with a resupply schedule attached. A consumable only works if resupply works. In the spring of 1945, German resupply did not work. So whatever the device could do on a range, in the field it was a capability with an expiry date and no refill, bolted onto a rifle the unit probably couldn't replace either. And for a piece of hardware delivered in those quantities, the combat record is close to silent. The paper trail is enormous. Contracts, monthly quotas, site production, delivery estimates. First-hand accounts of a curved barrel being used to kill somebody are almost nowhere. Then the Americans found them. Most GIAs who handled one treated it as a curiosity or a gag, and the attachments came into Allied hands largely as loose oddities rather than as weapons taken off men who had been fighting with them. But U.S. Army Ordnance did not laugh. They investigated it properly. Test firing by Captain Sharp, interrogation of Colonel Scheide, and of a German Armaments Ministry officer, Major Fred Hartmann, by an Ordnance Technical Intelligence team, and a formal report out of the Office of the Chief Ordnance Officer, dated the 18th of July, 1945. The language in that report is nothing like the reputation this device carries today. It called the thing an entirely new idea in controlling and changing the direction of a bullet's delivery. It described the application to the Sturmgewehr 44 as partially practical. A soldier could fire around a corner without exposing himself, shoot from a foxhole, or fire blind from inside a tank. Which sets up the sharpest irony in the whole affair. Those same American evaluations were dismissive of the Sturmgewehr 44 itself. They marked it down for its stamped sheet metal construction and its rough fit and finish. And they particularly disliked its intermediate cartridge, the single most consequential small arms idea to come out of the war, the concept that every modern assault rifle on Earth descends from. So the U.S. Army examined a rifle and an attachment. It shrugged at the rifle that would define the next 80 years, and wrote up the bent barrel as a promising line of inquiry. They inspected a revolution and a dead end, and got both of them backwards. Then it went quiet. The Americans and the Soviets stripped defeated Germany for technology, and they took a great deal. Rockets, jets, night optics, machine tools, and the people who built them. Curved barrels were not on the list. Nobody adopted the concept. Nobody built a successor. And for roughly the next 50 years, the idea of shooting around a corner effectively disappeared from military development. What makes that silence remarkable is that the problem had not been solved. Between 1945 and the end of the century, armies fought in Seoul, in Hue, in Beirut, in Grozny. Rooms, stairwells, roof lines, precisely the environment this device was built for. The problem didn't shrink. It grew. So for 50 years, soldiers kept paying for corners, and nobody built the tool. Because everybody had drawn the wrong conclusion about why this one failed. Here is the wrong conclusion, and it's the one repeated almost everywhere this device comes up. That it failed because you can't bend a bullet's path. That is not what killed it. The bullet went around the corner. Torn up, slowed, scattered, but it went, and at close range, it killed. As a machine for delivering a projectile around an obstruction, the thing worked badly, and it worked. What broke it was the other half of the job. Sort the failures, and they all fall into one pile. barrel geometry drifting out from under the sight, a mirror fogged by vented gas, a reflected front post you have to align on a target you cannot see, too slow to bring onto a moving man. Not one of those is a failure of ballistics. Every single one is a failure of seeing and aiming. This device redirected the bullet and left the shooter squinting at a reflection of his own iron sights. It solved the easy half brilliantly and the hard half barely at all, which explains the 50-year silence. As long as engineers filed the story under "you cannot turn a projectile," there was nothing to build on. File it under "the hard part is vision," and the whole problem opens up, because vision is precisely what technology was about to get extremely good at. The next serious attempt didn't come from a superpower armory. It came out of counterterrorism work in the early 2000s from Lieutenant Colonel Amos Golan of the Israel Defense Forces. The corner shot. Look at what it does differently, because the difference is the entire lesson. It doesn't touch the bullet. The barrel stays straight. The weapon, typically a service pistol with variants running up to a 40mm launcher, sits in the front section of a frame that hinges near the middle, roughly 60 degrees. The front half, gun included, swings around the corner. The operator stays behind the wall with the rear half, and he isn't peering into a mirror at his own front sight. There is a camera up front and a screen at the back. He sees what the muzzle sees. Direct, full size, in real time. Same tactical problem as 1944. Opposite engineering philosophy. Don't make the projectile do the work. Move the weapon, and above all, move the eye. Nothing is asked of the bullet that a bullet doesn't already do. It didn't win any wars either, and it was never sold as though it would. It went to police tactical units and special operations as one specialized tool among many, folding back into a conventional forward-firing configuration in seconds. That restraint is part of the difference too. The German device was pitched into a system that needed miracles. This one went into a system that needed options. Now go back to the tank, because that thread finished even more decisively. The remote-controlled roof gun, the expensive path Germany couldn't afford at scale in 1944, is the line that won. It grew into the remote weapon station, a gun mounted on the hull, aimed and fired by a crewman who never opens a hatch, slaved to day optics and thermal sights. Add the camera suites now ringing modern armored vehicles for all-round vision, and the dead zone closes. Not by bending anything, by putting eyes and a motor where a man's head used to have to go. And the endpoint of that logic is flying over cities right now. A small drone is the purest available answer to looking around a corner without exposing yourself. Nothing about the projectile is compromised, because the thing that goes around the corner isn't the projectile. It's the sensor. Curved barrel, remote mount, corner shot, drone. One continuous line of reasoning, and every successful step along it moved the eye instead of the bullet, which is also why this object refuses to die. And here it's worth being precise, because the popular version is lazy. It gets filed with the Desperation Projects, a bunker fantasy from the last months, one more wonder weapon dreamed up while the Reich burned. The record says otherwise. The work started in 1942, out of an industrial housekeeping problem on a test stand. It was drawn, cold-formed after rifling, fitted with Zeiss optics, ordered through a real procurement chain, tested by its makers, and then measured by its enemies. Whatever else it wasn't a fantasy. It was a serious answer, aimed at the wrong half of a serious question. And unlike almost any other weapon, you can see the reasoning with your eyes. A rifle looks like a rifle. Someone has to tell you what's clever about it. Hold one of these and the idea is right there in the shape, the curve, the little mirrored frame, an argument about geometry rendered in steel. That's why it ends up in museum cases and in games, and on every list of strange weapons ever compiled. It is a thought you can look at, which makes the last turn in the story quietly strange. Because for a device built and shipped in those quantities, the documented survivors are almost nothing. Real provenanced examples, like the Vorsatz one with its mirror frame in the Royal Armouries collection, number in the handfuls. When one reaches auction, it is treated as a genuine rarity, priced among the scarcest German small arms items of the war. Tens of thousands ordered, thousands built, a few dozen accounted for. If you want more of this, the object taken apart until you can see the thinking inside it, failures included. Subscribing is what keeps them coming. The Sturmgewehr 44 itself gets the same treatment next, the rifle that made this entire strange experiment possible in the first place. The American report from July 1945 got one thing exactly right. It said this device opened up a new field of research. It did. Camera-sighted weapons, remote mounts, drones. An entire century of putting the eye where the body cannot go. Just not the field those officers thought they were describing, and not through anything they chose to keep. Because the bent barrels themselves went east by the thousand. Only a handful ever came back. Nobody knows what happened to the rest.